Hello, my name is
Hi.
Kent Campbell. Welcome to a therapist training episode on boundaries and multiple relationships for counselors. This is a video meant to train graduate students and therapists about the nuances of working with boundaries and multiple relationships. And I'm here with my colleague Sabrine, and Sabrine, I'll invite you to introduce yourself now.
Hey, hi everybody. I'm Sabrine. I work as a AMFT, almost a licensed therapist, about to give the exam, but I work in an Islamic spiritual counseling center catered towards Muslims, but I've worked in schools in different capacity in prior practice with Kent. So really happy to be here and share.
Exactly. And likewise, myself, a marriage and family therapist. I serve on the CAMP ethics committee, and I'm enjoying teaching these lessons on the ethical and legal issues about being a mental health counselor, mostly in the state of California. This video is designed to talk to mental health counselors in general. We're not going to talk specifically about very many things about MFT, specific or otherwise, except for ethics codes. I think that the lessons and things Sabrine and I are going to talk about here will be pretty applicable across the board. The idea is that in psychotherapy, the space here is in its own ways sacred, and the space is treated such that we want to have real intentionality about not having the client and the therapist interact outside this room in most cases, if at all possible. And when there are those interactions outside of the therapy room, they're called dual or multiple relationships. And that's what we're going to focus on today. The first thing that I'll say is that not all interactions outside the therapy office are unethical. There are a lot of ways that they can be unavoidable and even helpful for the clients and the therapists. We're going to talk a lot today about how therapists should navigate those choices and about what kinds of situations lend themselves to healthy and appropriate dual relationships. One of the first things that I'll say is that a therapist should do their best to anticipate what would be difficult or not for their patients. That is that if I'm working with someone and I know that they're having conflict with someone in their family, if I were to arrive at a place where they were there with their family member, that would likely be something that would be very difficult. However, if my client and I were both to go to the same music concert or athletic event where there were 20,000 people, it's probably likely we wouldn't see each other, and that probably wouldn't be very problematic. The types of treatment also make a difference. If I'm doing psychoanalytic work with my patient where we're really wrestling with projection and deep processes, that might be really different than someone who's receiving coaching or talking about a fear of heights, who might be using a real structured cognitive behavioral approach. So both the setting and the therapy impact things. But the idea is that therapists should be intentional about what kinds of problems might arise from meeting outside.
Right.
Sabrine, do you think about this?
Yeah, and one of the things to be, mindful of is like there can be boundary crossings or boundary violations. There's like levels to it. So in terms of what the roles and limits of the relationship, the therapeutic relationship is, sometimes you can cross the boundary. So say, for example, if you are at that music concert and you happen to be seated next to each other or something, to have a little bit of a realization that, is this a boundary crossing or boundary violation? How does this affect the relationship? Because it's to notice what leads to harm to the client, what is best for the client. So there may be some instances where we meet outside that may not be a violation, but it might be a boundary crossing, and to process that. And so, yeah, boundary crossings are they're a departure from a commonly practiced that could potentially benefit the client. So, in terms of like maybe running into them in a store or something that is not planned, that could be a boundary crossing. Or like what's happened with me occasionally is, because I'm part of a small Muslim community, we have events where, there are a lot of events that I've run into clients, and it's funny because if they come back and they process later and they're like, it's like I saw my teacher outside of class. Like it's for them, and for every client it's different. For some it's like, oh my God, what is my therapist doing here? How is she seeing me here? For others,
Yes.
it's like it's amusing to see your therapist outside of the contained space of the office. And then sometimes it could just come in forms of self-disclosure. So
Mhm.
I have some clients that are very curious about who I am, what I do, and very conscious of how I keep that away from them in the room. While others are very conscious of not wanting to know anything about me. And
Yes.
so to be mindful of what helps the client versus what harms the client in even that self-disclosure, because sometimes even that can be a violation because it could harm a client.
It could be.
And one of the things I have to really keep in mind being in that small community is when I'm
Mm.
giving talks or lectures or trainings, if I notice a client in the room, I have to be mindful of what I'm saying, because sometimes clients can take that as a personal thing of, oh, is she talking about me? Or is
Mhm.
she referring to me? And so just kind of having that uh, as a something to keep in your mind and something to be conscious of when working with different kinds of clients, different personalities, different backgrounds, that you can always have something to process and say and be present for the client in their best interest while also being present for the community.
That's
And
right.
then one of the things just to mention is touch, even in terms of touch.
Mhm.
So uh, in some clients, hugging is something that I'm very mindful of not doing, because it affects, and I know that there's a whole conversation in the therapy world amongst therapists about to hug or not to hug. But with some clients, engaging, if it will be helpful or if it will not be helpful, there's a strong boundary that I draw with that, because if I do cross it, it can be a violation, knowing their history and knowing what they've been through.
Right.
Just being mindful of that. And then opposite gender touch too, because in the Muslim community, opposite genders, we don't touch. And
Mhm.
so being mindful of how that it works as well. Just some, examples to keep in mind and share with experiences that I had.
Exactly, exactly. And it reminds me of a bunch of mine, right? Today, with an adult client, I had to tell him, remind him I was not going to be in the office next week. And he asked me where I was going. And I explained to him that I wasn't going to tell him because I'm keeping a boundary about professionalism and looking to avoid us being buddy-buddy. And he was absolutely understanding of that. Yesterday, for the 10-year-old boy, I disclosed much more about that, because to a 10-year-old boy, he wouldn't understand why there would be this kind of boundary set up.
Right.
Um, and likewise, as I'm, meeting with a young man who's really distressed and on the outside a real tough character, when he asked me for a hug one time out of 200, I'm going to give him the hug, because to me in that moment, what he's saying is, he really needs to feel, it would make him feel closer and connected and supported if I cross that boundary. And so I do that intentionally. And yet I don't hug most people most of the time, just like you said. So
Right.
nuances and appreciating intentionality, right? What things mean.
Right. And that's the beauty of it, is I think how we are with each client is how they need us to be, and that that relationship really is what helps
Mm-hmm.
the modality of change, like how they can heal, how they can go through things, is to be present and attuned to what the
Mm-hmm.
client needs.
Exactly. Sabrine, can you and I each tell one story now about running into clients outside the office and how you chose to
Yeah.
um,
So
learn to?
I have lots of stories of this, because it happens on one too many occasions. But I've run into the clients in the store while just like shopping with my husband, and and it's a weird like switch that has to happen, because when you're outside of the zone, you're shopping, you're in your non-therapist hat mode, and then it just has to switch where the good thing about being a Muslim and being hijabi is if you see another hijabi, we say salam. So we will greet each other. And once you know that you're Muslim, people will greet each other. So it's to be mindful of not letting my husband know these are my clients or these may be my clients.
Yes.
And that I know them outside of any space. And, so it's just how you interact with each other. So running into stores, I have to be mindful of that, just being the cordial salam. What I do outside of when we start sessions is I actually, there's an expectation that people can have of how therapy and things are going. So I set the expectations before in terms of when I'm talking about informed consent and confidentiality, there that, being in this community, we may run into each other outside at events. And when we do, I follow your lead. And I say, luckily, we are Muslim, so we say salam to every Muslim.
Right.
Beyond that, I will follow your lead in terms of how much interaction. And then I set the boundary that what we talk about in session, we will not talk about outside of session. This is the only space for that, to prevent anyone coming and being like, hey, what we talked about last week? Like, I just had this aha moment. That's not the space for it.
Right.
Then there are weddings that come up, things like that. Intimate occasions, social gatherings where it's me hanging out with some close friends, and then someone comes in that is also their friend, but happens to be my client too. And it's how do I get out of that situation? Because again,
yes,
I have to be mindful of what is beneficial to the client.
Right. But thankfully, and intentionally, you work really hard to make sure the clients are informed about what should happen. And you're explaining to them that what's most important is not disclosing their confidentiality and protecting the sacred work that happens in the room.
Exactly.
For sure.
Exactly. And there's some that you can foresee. And so like with Ramadan, right now we're in the month of Ramadan. So I can foresee that happening. And so every Ramadan, I go through the same thing with clients that you may see me because we have night prayers, we have a lot of mosque activities. I'll go through it. Say you might see me in the mosque. Again, this is how it is. We won't talk about what we have here.
Right.
And one of the things that I do personally is I have a space that I sit at. And
that's right.
clients will recognize that space. And it will be for myself as well, because I need that spiritual space for myself, for my own enjoyment of Ramadan and practicing Ramadan. So I will have my prayer space, and it's known to everybody in the mosque that that's Sabrine's spot. Even my nieces and nephews now know that that's my spot. So, but with clients, it's actually a very therapeutic way of having them have the same predictability, that if they come to the mosque, they know where I will be sitting. So if they want to interact with me, they need their space, they will avoid that spot. And then but if they are curious or anything, they'll pass by. But I also set the boundary that that's my spiritual time. So we won't be talking or interacting. Sometimes with younger clients, there's this excitement, like looking at, oh, she's like, my therapist is there and she's like reading Quran and she's doing this. So then I'll see them kind of giggling with their friends, running back and forth and peeping in and noticing me. And I'll smile and just like acknowledge it, but I will stay in my zone and space, and then I will process that afterwards with them. And in terms of what was that for you? So just with these kind of nuances, like you said, it's a lot of processing and going back and forth. It may not have to be a one-time occasion. And some you can predict happening like this, some you cannot predict, like going to a social gathering with your friends and suddenly having to adapt. Or one of my colleagues here, she ended up at a client's home. She was invited to a community dinner. And she ended up at a client's home and she texted me, what do I do? So it's always keeping the client's best interest in mind whenever we're going.
Exactly. we can do so much, forethought and looking to think about things. We can think about them ahead of time and discuss and process afterwards. You bet. We'll take a few minutes to step through some of the guidelines that mental health care providers have. Finishing this idea about violations, the notion is that the therapist is in a position of power, and it would be relatively easy to do things that would harm the client intentionally or unintentionally, and that there are ethical and legal guides about what that needs to look like. For marriage and family therapists in the state of California, from the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, CAMFT, the Code of Ethics have these two points that talk about the idea about dual relationships. The first being that MFTs are aware of their influential position, and so they avoid exploiting the trust or promoting the dependency of such people, their clients. MFTs, therefore, in general, avoid dual relationship with patients that are reasonably likely to impair the professional judgment of the therapist or lead to the exploitation of the client. It explains what this is, and it says, not all dual relationships are unethical, and some cannot be avoided. When concurrent or a subsequent dual relationship occurs, the MFTs take appropriate professional precautions to ensure that their judgment is not impaired and that no exploitation will occur. We can go on to see the ways that in other codes, like the American Counseling Association, talks about how therapists are not supposed to work with anyone who's close to their client. So a therapist should not be close friends or romantically involved, or the therapist for folks who are cousins or family members or have some kind of close acquaintanceship. A therapist is not going to offer therapy for anyone they've been in a romantic relationship with. There should be a discussion of boundaries, and the idea is about risks about attending a ceremony like a wedding or a graduation, to talk about it ahead of time and be careful at what that looks like. Documenting when these decisions and boundary crossings come up is important, and as we can make obviously clear from general common sense, therapists are not supposed to be in sexual or romantic relationships with their partners. So, I mean, you mentioned this idea before, and maybe I'll read this paragraph and ask if you have other thoughts. But central to why this is so important is that MFTs believe, and mental health care practitioners believe, that psychotherapy works because the relationship between the therapist and the client is the agent of change. It's the relationship that allows people to process difficult experiences, to grow, and to change. And the risk is that if we have interactions outside of this office, that might negatively impact the work that could be done for the client or lead to a client being exploited. So yeah, any thoughts on that part, Sabrina, we mentioned before?
Yeah, I think that word agent of change, of the therapist and the client, the relationship is the agent of change. That's really what I keep at the forefront when I'm working with the clients in session, but to also manage any interactions outside of session. So like I said, some I can expect and I'm prepared for, but others I will not expect. And so I have to kind of switch into, okay, what would be the best for the client? And of course, we're human. Sometimes that may not happen, but to process that and to repair that relationship is a way of, helping the therapeutic alliance and also being the agent of change. Because then the clients are also learning about themselves and learning about how they process this or how they came about and having these difficult conversations. So I think sometimes for me, for faith is a big aspect, but sometimes I believe that God brings about some interactions that actually can increase that healing process. And so for me, it's channeling whatever happens outside, working towards not crossing the boundary, right? Not going into the violation zone, and actually not even coming close to the violation zone, just staying
Mhm.
far away from that boundary. But when it
Yes,
does happen outside, to automatically think of, okay, how can I channel this to be of benefit for the client?
yes,
And I think that presence in and of itself is what helps the client also to understand and kind of name things and label things that may go unsaid, that helps with the therapy work ultimately.
exactly. Exactly. It reminds me of the way you've taught me that part of Muslim thinking is that things happen for a reason. And if we can use them for what I would call grist for the mill, if we can make good use of it, it can be helpful for all.
Right.
One of the articles that David Jensen, used to be a camp lawyer, wrote, called the Unlawful or Unethical Dual Relationship article, lists these different categories of ways that multiple relationships can be troublesome. And we're talking mostly about social and personal. The following were ones that were reasons why clinicians were being reprimanded by the licensing board for misbehavior. You can imagine some have to do with sexual or improper physical contact, engaging in business or financial arrangements with a client, caretaking, that is, a therapist doing things to take care of the client, like having the client sleep at their home or providing some other medical care for the client that blurred the boundaries about what was happening. Improper gift giving or receiving was one category. Interfering with personal autonomy and decision making, so a therapist telling the client what they need to do in their lives. Inappropriate therapist self-disclosure, where the therapist is talking about themselves in a way that isn't benefiting the client. Getting too enmeshed, or even providing employment for patients. These are the kind of big categories where there are people on a regular basis who this has been something where these crossings have been problematic.
That reminds me of some clients may ask you, because marriage is a little different. Like, we don't date as much in the Muslim community. I mean, some Muslims, they will date, and they will, but some conservative Muslims, they will not date and have relationships outside of marriage. So sometimes clients will be like, well, do you know anyone I could marry? And so it's maintaining that as well, that I am your therapist, I'm not a matchmaker.
Right.
Because
right.
they're, in their mind, they're like, well, you're probably working with a lot of people and you know a lot of people, so maybe you know someone that's a good fit for me.
Right. And tempting is the therapist to want to help our client in that way.
Yeah.
And for me, that's come up when a client says, I really need a job, and I'm aware of a job opening somewhere I think they might be a good fit for. Important for me to think about what's my role and how does that work? Yeah.
Right. And what I do usually is I have referrals and references. I'm like, these people, they do matchmaking. You could reach out to them and ask them.
Yes.
So it kind of manages that. That's not my role.
Exactly. So we've been talking about special considerations, but explain this idea that this slide talks about.
So, I mean, I think being in a small town community, being a minority in this community, there's a lot of interaction that happens because we kind of are like magnets to each other, right? We want to be in each other's presence, and having to have mental health in Islam, it's a very specialized way of working. And so a lot of people are not aware of the mental health aspect, but maybe aware of the Islamic principles, and then a lot of people may be aware of the mental health principles, but not the Islamic principles. And so what really that I work with is combining the two, and all my colleagues work with. And so in that, we're in the community a lot. In this Ramadan, even every weekend, I've had talks, trainings, workshops, and so running into clients is a given at any moment. So in that, it's really managing in terms of like what I said before, in the informed consent, building that in. But then when it happens, so for example, I went myself to seek knowledge at one event. There's like a scholar coming and he was teaching on a particular chapter of the Quran, and I really
Mhm.
wanted to learn. And so I was there seeking knowledge, but I knew that there would be clients there. And so what I would do is I
Mhm.
would place myself in a way that they could see me, I couldn't see them. And so I was at
Mhm.
the front, which I usually like to be
Mhm.
so I can learn and focus. But I
Right.
was at the front. I arrived earlier so they could see me coming in and know that she's around. I would sit in front so they could see me. I could not see any of them. And then afterwards, when we
Mhm.
go out for prayer or something, because sometimes when we're praying, if you know, in a Muslim community, when we pray in congregation, we're standing next to each other. And so that's also happened with me, where a client may be praying next to me, or
Mm.
his parent may be praying next to me, and
Yeah.
he may turn around and be like, "So how's she doing?" So, which I have to navigate again and talk to parents with, like maybe we can arrange a time to talk
Yes.
and discuss how she's doing. But in these kind of events and prayers, they will see me walking around or with my family even, and are curious about, oh, that's her
Mhm.
mom, that's her husband. So in that aspect, it's maintaining that and that's another different kind of self-disclosure, right? That when you're coming in with your family, and to see this is my therapist family, but to
Mhm.
process after, like, some of my clients have said, oh, it was, for me, it was like seeing my teacher outside of class, and
Yeah.
I thought you lived in that office. I didn't know you existed.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And in some ways, Sabrine, what you're describing, in some ways it takes away some of the shame, particularly the way that Islam promotes the idea about health in so many different ways. But it takes away some of the shame to be able to say, um, of course, my therapist is a human being, and I'm glad we're in the same community. I can see some benefits that would come from that kind of a situation. I'll give what comes next. Just a couple examples that come up for me as a therapist also, and that would be um, when it comes to a therapist in private practice. I know not to rent office space in the building where my therapist is, because that would lead to me bumping into them too often. And so it's my job to have some space and find my own office, not in their building. The other part was going to conferences and meetings, that sometimes therapists and clients, particularly if they're both therapists, will talk about who's going to go to which this workshop or not, and whether it's okay for them both to be there or separately. But this idea that you mentioned before about talking about it removes a lot of the chances of things kind of going awry.
Right.
Our
And
next slide
and
here. Yeah, go ahead.
oh no, I was just thinking it's also considering when the dual relationships can happen even in a small community. I think you've
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, like, with financial and other business, and then even because you have, like, the CPAs, or when you're going to the Muslim community, you have
Yes.
these kind of relationships going on. So to be mindful of, this is not the person that I can go to, or this,
Right.
if my family is going to someone for a business, like, I cannot work with them in some aspects. Or you will have people that know you, um,
Mm-hmm.
you've known and worked with in some level, come to you and be like, well, can you be my therapist? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so to also be mindful of, like, because in some cases it may be okay. I don't know them at that point where it's we've had a close, intimate connection or relationship. I just know them around through the community, and so it's okay to see your daughter or son. But if I feel it would damage the relationship and not help, then also managing that in the community and being mindful of, we know each other from here. This is the referral I can give to you for this
Yes.
case. So
And
yeah,
that would happen. Yep,
that.
that makes sense, Sabrine. And that would happen even for me also, right? There are people that I know from my life here who will say to me, Kent, would you be my therapist, or would you know someone I could work with? And there are some times when I've known the person, a decade ago very briefly, and I felt comfortable working with them. And other times where no matter what the connection was, I would say, we live in the Bay Area. We live in an urban area where there are a lot of great clinicians. Let me connect you with someone else. I'm not the only good therapist. There are a lot of other people, like you said, to have a good network of referrals. Super important, and can avoid some of the trouble that can come from that.
Mm.
I'm trying to think of people that There have only been, I can think of two in 20 years. I can think of two times where I worked with someone who I had met previously. And both those times generally worked okay. One of the fears is if I know someone from elsewhere, that I couldn't be fully honest with them, or they would be reluctant to be fully honest with me because they wouldn't want to be judged, or fear that I would somehow treat them differently in public, or they would have an expectation about who I am and how I would treat them. And so that those are the kind of things that can be difficult, but can be talked about. And if we're in a small community, like we're describing yours, or if we're describing someone who's in the military or a university where folks are attending classes and also serving in the counseling office, or in small towns where there aren't many choices within a large geographic area for accountants and dentists and therapists, and you have to have dual relationships. The idea behind the ethics code is to work hard to talk about them and find ways to make sure that they can be healthy and beneficial for everyone, as opposed to stumbling into things that can be unhelpful.
Right. Right.
Some of the things that don't work that we've mentioned about trying to be a therapist for someone who you're too close with, or if you have an unbalanced role with. One idea is that if you're the therapist for a family with a child, you can't also take on the role about being the court evaluator and deciding who should have custody of the child, rather. That's one or the other kind of a position. Not someone you've dated before, and not becoming close to people who are in your clients' lives. Here's our slide and picture of you. And we should have put this at the beginning. I think that we've heard about this way. What else would I ask you about? I was going to ask you about the part about you having your own place in the mosque, because I think that speaks to your care and attention and having a way to manage this.
Yeah, I think that I've been doing that for, I think, about 4 years or 4 or 5 years now, having that same place. And so at the beginning, I would notice more of client eyes, or like even, just like people roaming around. But now I think, and that's the nature of therapy, when the predictability is there, that now it's kind of more that I do have that space to myself and people know. And so it was a move on my part to also give myself that time and space and model for clients that you need to have that time to yourself and the spiritual growth and boundaries as well. And then at the same time to establish predictability and safety for clients, so they know that this is where she will be in that aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about the Khalil Center? I would ask also
So Khalil Center is where I work, and it's a psycho-spiritual Islamic center. We do community education, we do individual, family, marital therapy. We have licensed clinicians that work. There are 5 branches actually that operate. So there's one in Bay Area, we have one in LA, one in New York. The headquarters is in Chicago, and then we have one in Toronto. And then there's also a school of training. So we train clinicians on traditionally integrated Islamic psychotherapy, where we really take in the rich heritage of Islam. And one of the things that I think surprises people is that because there's like a misunderstanding, but since the 9th century, even before, mental health has kind of been built into it's in the faith. But since the 9th century, there was this physician by the name of Al-Balkhi who really pioneered and brought up, like, he had a manual that he would work with in treating patients. And so he would have clinical pathology, like he would look at 2 instances, if it's internal or external, and treat people with that in what were big hospitals that were set up to treat patients that were going through mental health difficulties and, with anxiety or others. He actually has what the manuscript that was discarded, he actually has the OCD, whatever is our symptomologies with OCD on the DSM, it matches exactly with what he had in the 9th century.
The 9th
And so
century.
there's a rich history of mental health in the Islamic tradition. And so what we do is we take that and we kind of have that, and then have what the law and ethics codes and what Western psychology teaches, because often what the Western psychology can teach and practice can miss what Eastern civilizations and cultures have. And so really watching our biases and trainings in that so that we can be aware of and provide for therapists in the right aspect. And you know, a lot of times that's where the cultural competency training and in that sphere comes in, where we have to also be aware of even non-Muslims that may come to us, how we can respond to them in their worldview and be present for them in that. So we do a lot of this in training clinicians all over the world, in Turkey, Qatar, all over the United States, in having community education. So we're doing a lot of work in providing workshops, trainings for schools and teacher, parent trainings, and wider community education trainings, having CRT, like community response training certifications, where it's mental health first aid. So just doing a lot of work in that aspect. Yeah.
It's fascinating to me the way that besides the diagnostic part from the 9th century, this idea about respecting other people's worldviews and having that something that in your community, that's something that's being paid attention to. And that's something that MFTs and thankfully many people in our country are paying attention to, the idea about being respectful that way. And even to this part about dual relationships, that when we're taking care of one another in our community, taking care of our neighbors, there are ways we can do that are ethically appropriate, and that's something that's been a part of your process as well.
It's because, we get I have all kinds of clients, and other clinicians have all kinds of clients from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different careers, different stories, and then some that we know that we're working with, but they don't want the community to know that they're coming here. Our office is located in the mosque, and so we're mindful of that as well. But it's oftentimes they feel, when we see them outside, the first encounter, usually when we see them outside, there is this level of shame, like, oh, she's seeing me outside. Will she let the confidentiality out?
Yeah.
But now that they've seen repeated kind of interactions of how I am, how we hold confidentiality, how the system works, how therapy works, it's really breaking that to the extent that they will say to others that, hey, that's my therapist. And so when they say it, I'm like, okay, I can either confirm or deny, right? But if someone comes and asks me, that's my response, which
correct
usually is, I usually try to maintain that even in that aspect, because when you say that, I feel like that can even confirm that, oh, if she's not saying anything, maybe she is seeing this person.
Right.
But when they say it, it makes me really happy, because it's really breaking that stigma of
exactly
people going through therapy and proudly saying, that's my therapist.
Exactly.
Or people coming to me and saying, hey, so-and-so told me you're her therapist. And I'm like, oh, well, okay.
And to me, the imaginary part that could come with that next is, and I want to be in greater wellness also. How can I do this? And that does sound like it's taking away shame, and it's beneficial for the client. It's helping them to feel more empowered and proud of who they are in their journey. And I think that's what we want. It reminds me, Sabrina, the way that there's social media and even this video, right? So there are ways on social media, on my business webpage, on LinkedIn, with this video where I'm out there in the world a bit, right? Not as much as you, but I'm out there a little bit sometimes. And as far as your public speaking and the way that you're so well known. But this notion that clients can choose, there needs to be discussion about what the consequences are of following someone on social media, and the way that if someone chooses to follow their therapist that way, they're disclosing potentially that they're connected to this clinician. I think things like being friends on LinkedIn is easier, but there could be people who are my clients who are going to watch these videos to wonder and want to get to know more about me, right? That there are ways that some we can control and some we can't, but being in dialogue about what it means and what messages people take from how they encounter us outside the therapy office, to me, that's the part where there's room to grow. Is the client, right? Is the client feeling?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just say one last thing. Is the client feeling like they're not as close to the therapist anymore because Sabrine's giving a lecture to 100 people and I'm just one out of 100 and she doesn't really care about me as much? Or does the client feel special because they get to be connected to us? Do they feel like they have more respect for us because we're teachers in our communities? I think there are different ways it can be interpreted, right?
Right, absolutely. And I've had both clients where they feel like, oh, she's on stage, she's talking, she's teaching, and that's my therapist. And then I've had others where there's this form of jealousy. What I thought she's only for me. What is she doing up there? Why is she seeing someone else? And it's processing that with the client and seeing what comes up. But you bring a great point on social media. So with social media, it's very different in terms of, I have like some colleagues that have their therapist page, and clients will add them or not add them. But for me, my social media is very private. And but clients will reach out, they'll find me, they'll try to add me or message me, and I will talk to them. Actually, in our informed consent, we have that too, that no social media, but in session, then I will process that with them. But where it can get blurry is WhatsApp, actually, because we have a lot of Muslim community groups with like Bay Area Muslims, or different WhatsApp groups where there are hundreds of people. Or on Facebook, there are a lot of people on like foodies group or something, where everyone here is part of that group to get information, right? Events going on, activities going on. So there it can get blurry, because then if I message, I have to be mindful of if there is a client in that group. I don't go searching for it, but I am aware that there may be some information. So, for example, my grandmother passed away recently in January, and I had to fly out to North Carolina to see that. But here I had to cancel sessions and take care of that. But the way that clients found out was through these community forums, where it was announced on WhatsApp, because people knew me. They're like, Sabrina's grandmother passed away, and so when clients were coming in and processing that with me, I was kind of like, okay, how did they discover that? But that's where it can get a little bit blurred with the WhatsApp groups, where I have to be very mindful of where I join, where I don't join, or leave a certain group. Exactly.
And I think some people solve that by having 2 phone numbers or 2 email addresses. But the way you're describing it, exactly. And hopefully it's something that can be used for the best and talked about. I think what we're getting here is to this notion that there are ways that connections outside of the therapy office can be helpful and are ethical. But the pieces we really need to consider when we're choosing to step closer towards a client in particular outside of session would be wondering about the therapist motivation. What's our reasoning behind this? It makes me think that a therapist has a right to be in the public, the way that you talked about being a part of your group. There are other groups, like if my kids want to play on a sports team or be in some kind of a club, and my client's child is also in that group, a therapist should be able to manage that, right? I should be able to be out in the community, but there need not be a reason for a therapist to be a hermit and totally secluded. Right. At any rate.
Yeah, it's a balance, and I think it's also a form of modeling for
Yes,
clients how to kind of maintain those boundaries, and that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of relationship. That you can be in the community, you can be out, but your information is preserved and is confidential,
yeah,
um, and that this can be a way of helping heal a relationship or things that you're going through.
that's right. That's right. The last piece on this slide I'll mention is the part about consultation. But I think it's really, I think that you and I did a great job talking through how to manage a lot of the pieces when you were first making some of these decisions. And for me, when I think about difficult decisions to make, the idea about talking with other clinicians, talking with colleagues, and consultation, a real important thing so that we don't lose our way without being very careful.
Hmm. Absolutely. I think it's essential even for me as a therapist, because sometimes when these situations happen, you manage it to for me to process it with in consultation or with someone, so that I'm not also bringing it into the therapy session.
Correct. Ooh, and you know what, Sabrina? I can imagine I might be resentful if I am. I'm really wanting as the therapist to go be a part of a group or do something, and I feel like I can't be there because my client is there.
Exactly. Yeah.
That, right? I can imagine the resentment that I might feel that might leak into the way that I interact with my patient. And to me, that's the part we have to be on the lookout for, right?
Right. Exactly. And so
Yeah.
processing that for myself is a very important part of doing the work for
Mhm.
it's
Yeah. Again, the last bullet point on this slide, I'll say this notion that when the therapy treatment ends, does the therapy live on? And the notion here is that the ethics codes say that after therapeutic treatment has run its course and ended and termination has happened, after 2 years, it's appropriate for a marriage and family therapist and a former client to have more interactions together, even romantic ones. But there's another notion that I think that a lot of people, a lot of ethical clinicians hang on to, that is that once a person has been a client, they've forever been a client, and really it would be inappropriate to look to get to be really close to that person, business, social, or romantic.
Mhm.
That's just not appropriate. You want the client to always be able to come back to you as the clinician, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But that's that notion there.
Right. And it depends on, I think, every person, the therapist and the client, how they
Mhm.
manage that.
Yeah. Yep. I think we can end on this slide right here. So, of course, sexual contact not appropriate. So, our last slide to kind of wrap up our talk for today, Sabrina, and thinking about social relationships. We've talked a lot about these. Um, we don't want to get enmeshed and lose our objectivity. Want to be careful about exploiting the client and taking advantage of them. Um, and this notion about clients wanting to have a place and a way to be connected to therapists. I got to tell you very quickly, I took a training a number of years ago, and it was my former therapist who was giving the lecture. And I knew this, and I went to go see this lecture because it was a subject matter I was really interested in, and I hadn't seen her in a very long time. But the power of walking into the room and sitting down and seeing her and hearing her voice brought back such waves of emotion for me. It was powerful in a way that I wasn't anticipating. It was like these memories of this voice that I'd internalized in a really good way to be a good part in my internal system. It was really powerful, and so I'm wary of taking that away from someone and not allowing them to have the way to have me hold that sacred place in their internal world. So I think
Right.
I'll end my thoughts there and invite you to see if there's anything else you want to say on this topic today.
No, that's beautiful, and that because I'm always curious when I'm doing these community education talks, and I see clients in the room. I'm always curious what it's like for them, and we
Yeah.
process it in the session. But I think sometimes there's some clients that are more reserved in processing it
Mhm.
than others, and so it's nice to know that and hear that. And for me, I think it's really, there is a thing that our prophet said, the best of you are those who benefit others. And it's really internalizing that in all of these relationships is what is the most benefit that comes from this, and is that, you know, preventing harm and doing good, and working with the client in their capacity and their worldview and what they're going through, and kind of seeing how that develops over time, because sometimes it may change, but to see where they're at, and to really meet them at that point, and being a safe and sacred space in this room, and also like as a person beyond this room, so that it kind of carries over, where if they're interacting with me elsewhere, they still have that kind of safety, that this person is a safe space to be around.
Right. And that's what matters most, protecting our clients' well-being.
Right.
Hooray. Well, Sabrine, I can't thank you enough. It's been such a pleasure to get to have this time with you, and appreciate you sharing your stories and helping these folks watching this video to think more about the nuances about how all this works. So I say thank you very much, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you and go through this and relive some memories too.
Right?
Yeah.
Indeed. Well, many thanks to you, Sabrine. Thanks for watching. Best wishes and bye for now.